Good morning. I think we're going to get started with the next panel. My name is Appelbaum. I'm the lead writer on economics for the New York Times editorial board and the author of a new book called The Economist's Hour. My comments are not on behalf of the New York Times editorial board, just to be clear. I want to start with a quote. In the early 1960s, a man named George Ball, who was the Undersecretary for Economic Policy in the Kennedy administration, walked into a meeting with a number of textile executives, mostly from the American South, and he began by telling them that he was wearing a British-made suit, a British-made shirt, shoes made for me in Hong Kong, and a French necktie. And the reason I start with that quote is that it captures something about the American policymaking elite in the mid-century. We are currently living in a period of resurgent nationalism, a style of nationalism I think of as turtle nationalism, where you draw on your hands and your feet and hope the rest of the world goes away. And that is often contrasted with what was said to have been a better kind of nationalism that prevailed in the mid-century, an embedded nationalism in which nations engaged in respectful cooperation, maintaining some degree of concern for the interests of their own populations while also cooperating internationally. And it is frequently held up as a world to which we would benefit by returning. And I want to complicate that story for you a little bit, because what George Ball's comments capture is that period of broad prosperity was something of an accident rather than the result of intentional policies. And indeed, the United States in that period often did very little to achieve that result. So the Bretton Woods Agreement, which organized currency relationships among nations after World War II, was constructed to be different than what had preceded it, which was a firm gold standard. Bretton Woods allowed nations to adjust their exchange rates by mutual agreement. And the purpose of that provision was basically to allow nations to adjust to trade imbalances, not by driving down the wages of their workers, but by adjusting the level of their currency. It was meant to be an accommodation to the rise of labor power, to changes in the electorate, to the reality that you had some responsibility for the economic welfare of your citizens. That was the theory. In practice, the United States found that it was impossible to adjust its exchange rate against other currencies because the Germans and the Japanese did not share the interest of the United States in allowing the United States to sell more goods in Germany and Japan. They preferred to be selling goods to us. And so what you had is a system that, in fact, did very little to accommodate the needs of workers. And this was perfectly clear by the early 1960s. And labor unions encouraged the Kennedy administration to create a program to help the workers who were then beginning to lose their jobs. They called it Trade Adjustment Assistance. It's still with us. During the first 7 years of that program, the federal government did not provide benefits to a single worker. Not because people weren't losing their jobs, but again, because government policy was rather indifferent to the needs of those workers. And was not constructed in a way that made it possible to help them. And so again, this period that is widely remembered as having been an era of concern for workers, I think the facts tell a more complicated story. The Bretton Woods Agreement ended in the early 1970s when President Nixon decided that it actually was not serving the interests of American workers, and he blew it up, quite memorably declaring that the United States did not need to compete with one hand tied behind its back anymore. But what he allowed to replace it, largely because he frankly didn't care about international monetary policy, was a system of floating exchange rates advocated by a group of economists who were then gaining power in the realm of economic policy, arguing that in general markets were better at allocating resources than bureaucrats, and that we should rely on markets to do things like determine the level of exchange rates. And that system comes into place, and by the early 1980s has become something of a religious conviction for members of the Reagan administration who regard the market as the only possible arbiter of exchange rates. Beryl Sprinkle, who is the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, Monetary Affairs, in the Reagan administration, tells Congress that it's unthinkable arrogance for the government to presume to know what level the dollar should be at compared to the yen or the mark or any other currency. So that you get this absolute faith in the power of markets to arrange exchange rates. And what happens, of course, is that the dollar goes up and away during that period. American workers are punished by those increases. It contributes to the hollowing out of the American manufacturing base. And so what replaces the Bretton Woods Agreement is ultimately something that proves even more damaging to the interests of workers. But the concept itself never fully took hold. The same thing plays out with currency controls, which proponents of reliance on markets regarded as probably the single most offensive form of national economic policy. They really hated it, and they spoke about it in a language that can sound almost incredibly overwrought to the modern ear. They thought of it as having been a product of Nazism, as being almost fascist in its essence, that a country that was preventing people from taking their money and going somewhere else was engaged in the ultimate form of economic force and manipulation of its population, that this was the essence of what they were fighting against. They wanted these capital controls to go away. And they began to succeed during this same period. George Shultz eliminated America's capital controls in 1974. He was the Treasury Secretary at the time. And he told investors in his statement that he was giving them the freedom to do what they wanted with their money. That's a very interesting use of the word freedom. There was an assertion here that the important thing was to let people have the freedom to move money across borders. The first time Milton Friedman met with Margaret Thatcher, the first thing that he told her was that the first thing she should do, should she become prime minister, was to get rid of Britain's capital controls. In the event, it took her a couple of months, and when Friedman was notified, he said, "Hooray for Margaret Thatcher," having achieved that goal as well. And of course, that policy then spread across the world through the intermediation of the international agencies that once existed to coordinate policy among nations, and by the 1980s had instead become vocal advocates for the deconstruction of those mechanisms of coordination and cooperation. But there's an interesting detail here that's quite important, which is that the nation that played the largest role in making this international policy was not the United States, but France, where the socialist government became a vocal advocate for the end of capital controls on the ground that capital controls were contributing to economic inequality. The French argued that only the rich had the opportunity to move money where they wanted under a system of capital controls because they could just evade it, whereas the middle class was being prevented from taking advantage of comparable opportunities. And so they pushed first for the members of what is now the EU, and then for the broader community of developed nations organized through the OECD, to get rid of these controls as an effort to reduce economic inequality. The road to where we are was paved with good intentions. The final aspect of this that I want to highlight is trade policy itself. Of course, a very old idea brought to us by economists, but not recently. But the way that it was carried out in the late 20th century took a very interesting form, largely through increasingly through bilateral treaties rather than broad international negotiations, and treaties that, particularly when the United States was one of the partners, increasingly took the form of efforts to protect private property and to force smaller nations to open their borders to the inflow of American goods and services that were still copyright protected and in other ways defended against any effort by those nations to take control of the property. One of the most interesting examples of this, which has already come up here, is the case of Chile, which probably embraced free market policies more wholeheartedly than any other nation. To the point, so Chile had been engaged in an effort to industrialize, as were many smaller developing nations. It abandoned that in the mid-1970s. The governor of its central bank at the time, a man named Alvaro Bardón, said that if comparative advantage dictated that Chile should produce only melons, then Chile would produce only melons. That was the economic philosophy that they chose to embrace. And it worked to a point. They became very good at exporting the ground under their feet, copper, salmon, melons, all of it. But they lost the ability to move up the supply chain. So a couple of years ago, Maersk, the shipping company, opened a factory in Chile to make the containers that it needs to ship Chilean fruit to the global market. They invested a huge amount of money in this factory and in training the workforce, and they closed it after 2 years, concluding that it was impossible to manufacture advanced objects in Chile. That's the extent to which the atrophy of the industrial sector in Chile has happened in recent decades. You also get a political atrophy in Chile. The country elected a socialist prime minister in 1999, president in 1999 for the first time since Salvador Allende. His name was Ricardo Lagos. He observed shortly after being elected that while military coups were bad, it was surely worse to have a populist treasury minister. He, in essence, had come down on Pinochet's side. That's where socialism had evolved to in Chile by that time, and where it largely remains today, opposed to, Chile still has one of the smallest social safety nets of any developed nation. It intermittently has a socialist government, but not one that's particularly interested in providing a social safety net. And this is sort of typical of the outcomes that you see. It's a more extreme case, but much the same thing transpired in the United States, where trade policies created hollowed out communities and left people relying on an attenuated social safety net, often without the ability to reconstruct their lives or to maintain a minimum standard of living, because there had been this turn in policy. So where does this all leave us? Well, it seems pretty clear to me that these policy choices are a big part of how we ended up in this political moment. The decisions informed by economists, often made by economists, about the shape of our national economic policy, and specifically the terms on which we engaged with the rest of the world, had the consequence of leaving many people out and leaving them feeling as if their lives were not improving, their opportunities were not improving. Importantly, in my own experience, talking to many people in this situation, the anger is often focused on the perception that their children do not have the opportunities that they had, that they can have a hard time seeing how their children might do better than they have done. And as a consequence, they are angry. And one expression of that anger, obviously, was the election of Donald Trump, who has few fixed beliefs, but one of those very few does appear to be a fervent belief in mercantilism. He does appear to see the world as a competition among nations, a zero-sum game in which our economic policies are pitted against those of other countries, not for mutual advantage, but to win or lose. Shortly after the election, his vice president, Mike Pence, told reporters that America had been relying on the free market and America was losing, which is something that it is inconceivable to think of a Republican saying, in the previous half century, but is now essentially government policy. So that is one form of response to this moment, one kind of nationalism that has emerged in response. And it has taken the form of, renewed trade restrictions, tariffs. The Trump administration has broached the idea of various forms of capital controls, recently discussing limitations on Chinese investments in the United States. In effect, we do have limitations on Chinese investment in the United States already, largely through the process of national security review of potential investments. And we've seen a sharp decline in Chinese investments in the United States. So you're seeing some of these policies that had become anathema, being revived and implemented in this new political moment. What's very interesting to me is that it's not just the Trump administration. Some of Mr. Trump's leading rivals in the Democratic Party are also articulating alternative versions of economic nationalism. That set of ideas is certainly at the core of Senator Elizabeth Warren's campaign. She can sound remarkably similar to Trump when she is talking about trade and economic policy and what the United States should be doing to strengthen its economic opportunities and its economic profile and its role in the world. She similarly has talked about reviving the old concept of industrial policy, meaning that the United States should be trying to pick winners and invest in industries and build competence in manufacturing and other high-value industries. And other Democratic candidates have similarly, shown an interest in these kinds of ideas. So what we have essentially is a rejection. You've got this sense that what we were doing is no longer working, that the policies pursued by both Democratic and Republican administrations. This point has been made several times today, but it's an important one. Our turn toward this moment was not some phenomenon in which one side of the political spectrum imposed its ideas on the other, but instead a collective embrace of a certain set of ideas that were seen as not just right, but really without alternatives. And so by the end of the 20th century, it gets awfully difficult to discern the difference between the economic platform of the Democratic Party and the economic platform of the Republican Party. The differences are much more on social issues. And in practice, they're both working toward very similar goals. And so with the 2008 crisis and the inflection point that that represents, you get a rejection, a sense that that stopped working and that something needs to take its place. And so far, the boldest ideas have largely revolved around some idea of a competition among nations in which the United States needs to do a better job of looking out for itself. So where does that leave us? Well, if, as many economists still do, you think that we would be better off engaging productively with the rest of the world for mutual advantage, one needs to be considering how you rebuild a political constituency for that idea, because it is in disrepair and that constituency has diminished significantly. And part of that project needs to be some revival of a case for international cooperation. Because even to the extent that what we're seeing is a rejection of the ideas of economists, it is also in a very important sense founded on the ideas of economists. The deconstruction of Bretton Woods and other systems of international cooperation was justified by the assertion that we were all better off if we basically looked out for ourselves and that that would produce the best collective results. That if each nation minded its own affairs and sought to improve its economic performance while trading freely with the rest of the world, we'd all end up in the best possible place. Chile would grow melons, the United States would send the tractors, or maybe Germany would send the tractors. We'd eat the melons with borrowed money, and that global system would produce benefits for everyone. The problem with that vision of the world is that it has tended to underwrite the current resurgence of nationalism by justifying this idea that we're all out there on our own, fighting for our own interest and advantage, and what's changed is an interpretation of how we secure those advantages, but not the underlying premise that in a free market world, everybody should be looking out for themselves and trusting that the market will deliver the best outcomes. That's the idea that it seems to me needs to be revisited in order to get better collective outcomes. That idea that there is no role for international coordination, that idea that we can't write rules for the marketplace to produce the outcomes that we want, that management of markets is inherently detrimental. Joe Stiglitz said at the outset today that markets are inherently, constructs, and I strongly agree with that. This question of what the rules should be is really at the very heart of what our political process should be focused on, in my view. And therefore, I think that, we are clearly at a moment when some new version of nationalism is going to emerge and take hold here and in other countries. The question is what kind? And I think engaging that answer a little bit differently is the road to getting to a better place. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Andreas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I don't know what the intentions of the organizers were, whether one of us is supposed to be a nationalist and the other one not. And so I think if that was the original plan, then maybe there's going to be some disappointment because I'm waiting for the slides to come, so I'm just talking a little bit about other things. Because I actually come down on a very similar place as Binyamin does with regard to the analysis of the current situation in which nationalism has spread both to the left and the right, has made a resurgence, and I also come down to the conclusion, similar to Binyamin, if I understood you correctly, that this is not necessarily a bad thing. So I have written about nationalism for a very long time, for over 20 years now, so before the current moment, and I have a slightly different, broader understanding of nationalism than most of you will have, and I would like to, sorry to be so academic, but I would like to introduce a more broader kind of understanding of nationalism than the current association with far right-wing populist policies. And so it is associated today with the far right or even with white nationalism. That's what most people associate when they hear the term nationalism. And in the eyes of liberals, of the mainstream educated population, such bad nationalism, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, chauvinist, and so on, stands in opposition to the good patriotism that everyone is willing to embrace. But from a, sorry, I have to move a little bit here because I have to see my slides are down here in the corner. But from a historical and comparative point of view, so if we make a step back, both are actually variants of nationalism. And it's only after World War II that patriotism became systematically distinguished from nationalism. Basically, one of the major reasons because the Nazi Party had National Socialist in their title, and so the term kind of became a pejorative term in the eyes of Western democracies. But both patriotism and nationalism are based on the same principles of political legitimacy. And the first one is the idea that states should be governed by members of the nation, that elites should be, in terms of their national background, like the people over whom they rule. Rather, so they shouldn't be foreigners, and so the foreign rule as in empires, British over Indians, the Manchu dynasty in Qing, China, and so on, became delegitimized. The second principle is that rulers, state elites, should primarily care about the interests of the national majority. They should be accountable to the members of the nation rather than rule in the name of their own interests, such as the interest of a dynastic house, as was the case in the pre-nationalist period of politics around the world. So nationalism and patriotism both are more or less nativist in the sense of that they're asking for control over the state by locals, by people who have deep roots on the territory and show a deep commitment to the local population. Now, how the nation's defined, how inclusionary, how exclusionary is a different, whether it embraces domestic minorities or not, whether it embraces recent members of the nation, immigrants and so on, that's a different question, but the tendency is nevertheless the same. And second, all forms of nationalism are populist. They privilege the interest of the masses over those of political and economic elites. And so this is just a kind of a conceptual clarification to kind of popularize the idea that nationalism is actually not exclusively, not even foremostly, a matter of the right-wing, anti-immigrant, chauvinist end of the political spectrum. And I would like to go a little bit further with some historical clarifications, with apologies to those who are mostly interested in the present moment and in the economic policy domain. Compared to other kinds of major political ideologies, nationalism is relatively poorly elaborated, is a relatively primitive political ideology, like many observers have noted over the years. And it is therefore very flexible and has historically combined or entered the marriage with lots of different kinds of ideological currents. It was in the 19th century in Europe, it was associated with liberalism, with classical political liberalism, as in the nationalist movements that swept through Europe in 1848 and then later on again. So that's how nationalism started, as a thoroughly liberal, committed to the idea of rule of law, committed to the idea of democracy and so on, ideology. It then combined with fascism in the interwar period, when right-wing movements that were nationalist/fascist came to power in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, and so on and so on. After the Second World War, nationalism combined with communism. In many of the anti-colonial movements in the global south that were mobilizing against empire, many of these movements were actually carried forward or even dominated by communist party organizations, such as in Vietnam and in the Chinese fight against Japan, and so on and so on. So today, all major ideological currents kind of carry forward this legacy of nationalist thinking in one way or another, maybe with the exception of orthodox free market libertarian kind of thinking, where nationalism indeed does not play much of a role. So the anti-immigrant populist nationalism of today emphasizes the nativist principle and turns it against immigrants, while the left-wing socialist movements emphasize the populist aspect of nationalism in their suggesting to tax the wealthy or the wealth of the very, very rich citizens away. So both rely on nationalist principles, on these twofold nationalist principles that I have mentioned. So are we all nationalists now? In a way, yes. So that's kind of my agreement with Binyamin's current diagnosis, although I come to it from a different kind of angle. I would like to also emphasize, and this is kind of dear to my heart as a historically minded sociologist, how deeply rooted nationalism is, not only in our ideologies, in the major kind of political currents, as I just tried to argue, but also in the institutional structures of the world that we live in with. And nationalism is, and I'm going through a series of institutional domains to show how deeply they're influenced by these twofold nationalist principles of thought and that I just mentioned. So nationalism basically provided the ideological foundation for the modern global system of states, the idea that each nation deserves a state on its own. The idea of national sovereignty is deeply influenced, of course, by the late 19th, early 20th century versions of nationalism. And so the entire state system actually is built on a nationalist foundation. Second, nationalism also provides an answer to the question that every democratic polity raises, or every democratic principle raises, which is where are the boundaries of the people that should govern themselves according to democratic rule. And nationalism provides the answer to that. Only citizens, members of the nation, should allowed to vote. So Guatemaltecans and Zimbabweans, it seems trivial, but one has to take a step back to see that it's maybe not that trivial, should not actually vote in an American elections, and Americans should not vote in a Guatemaltecan election. And third, since in the eyes of nationalist ideologues, the nation itself should not be further divided into strata with different rights and privileges. That's what nationalists argued against when nationalist movements came out of feudal and imperial states in the 19th century. Since there's this image of equality, a definition, that's a defining criteria of the nation, legal equality, nationalism also has been married historically to the idea of equal citizenship. And many of the nationalist movements have propelled this idea very forcefully and sought to realize it. And the first book on nationalism was by a legal scholar called Francis Lieber, and I'm proud to report that my named chair here at Columbia is named after Mr. Lieber. That's maybe why I know about him. He's otherwise not very popular. So, but he was he wrote actually the first book with on nationalism, and he opposed the principle of nationalism or nationhood to the Confederates to the principle of legal inequality, slavery, that at the time was still the law of the land in the South. So revealing this historical association between nationalism and the idea of the nation and legal equality. Then finally, nationalism also motivated the development of welfare systems, of redistributive systems, without the idea of the nation as a kind of a hyper-extended family, where every member owes solidarity to every other member, even if they're perfect strangers and have never met and have no real family ties with each other. Without that idea, actually, welfare systems would have been very hard to legitimize. And historically speaking, most of the thrust in the development of welfare systems came after massive wars, mobilization for war, in times of very strong nationalist sentiments of distinctiveness and collective sacrifice. Nationalism also underpinned the massive expansion of public goods provisions by the modern state. So once the state is supposed to act in the name and in the interest of the nation, it is appropriate to erect public health systems for members of the nation, systems of public education where children would, among other things, be taught also the national language, national history, be forged into this national mold of and be taught, a sentiment of pride in the achievement of their own nation. National infrastructure projects, national highway systems, the park system in the US and so on, all of this, of course, deeply infused by sentiments of national belonging, mission, and distinctiveness, and so on. Okay. Okay, let me skip that. We have this watch here, by the way, that's such a brutally disciplining element. It's brilliant. It is so simple. Okay, so let me say something. So I argued that most of the current major political movements have a nationalist component, and I argued that this is because nationalism is so deeply institutionally rooted in our current societies, at least in the developed West, that it's difficult to actually argue outside of nationalist frameworks. However, nationalism comes and goes. Sometimes it becomes hot and virulent, like today. Sometimes it recedes to the background. It's more like a quiet assumption, ideological assumption that everybody makes. So I argue that when one of these twofold principles of nationalism is violated, then the likelihood that you get hot nationalism, that it becomes politically salient, that political movements pick it up, increases. And so when national self-rule, the first principle, is violated, movements are likely to emerge to call for the restoration of what is perceived as a violation of the principle of national self-rule. And the anti-European Union movements across Europe, at least if you believe in the analysis that I made so far, are kind of not surprising to eventually emerge because they can so easily be portrayed as a violation of the principle of self-rule. You have the Eurocrats, you have Brussels, you have Diktat, from far away that is not fully democratically legitimized either. So it can be easily portrayed as a version of a kind of a new colonialism, or rather a new imperial kind of situation. And you have the anti-Soviet movements during the Gorbachev era that are also, the Baltic states and so on, and then it spread to the Caucasus that are also that took this opportunity to decry, to scandalize that the principle of national self-rule had been violated for decades under Soviet rule. When the political elites rule in the interests of global interests or of economic growth, independent of its distributional consequences, or in the name of human rights, then movements to restore the priority of concern for the average member of the nation emerge. So if this principle of nationalist doctrine is violated, you might have movements as well. Anti-immigrant movements in Germany in the wake of the de facto open border policy that lasts for a couple of months. Anti-elite populism that you have today in the United States after a long period of disregard for the consequences of economic policy making for the average working class member of the country. These movements can emerge from the right, from the left, such as the two presidential candidates now, Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, and so on and so on and so on. Or they can emerge from the right, Trump, Le Pen, all the other kind of right-wing movements all across Europe. Of course, whether and when exactly such movements emerge also depends on leadership. What you need is someone who has the skills as a political entrepreneur to scandalize the present situations or to mobilize these nationalist tropes and rhetorics effectively. You have to have the organizational tools to do so. You have to create a movement, followers, you have to fundraise, all these kinds of things. And whether it emerges on the left or on the right, I didn't want to go into that because it gets complicated. Depends also on the configuration of parties in a particular country, and then all kinds of things matter, whether you have a two-party system, whether you have a multi-party system, whether the left, and that's most important, still has a grip on voting class voters, whether the on working class voters, whether the working classes are still organizationally bound to the parties of the left, or whether these organizational bonds have been broken, as in the US, where they have not, like in Portugal, where the Communist Party still has, its cells in all across the country, including in the rural parts of the country, and where this discontent was channeled through, or nationalist discontent was channeled through the established party system. So all kinds of things come into play that I would not like to talk about in too much detail. When these principles of nationalist doctrine are not violated or not as visibly as in the times that I was just talking about, then these movements fade away or they never develop, they recede into the background, and that is perhaps the case from the 1950s into the 70s in the developed West, when liberalism was combined with a healthy dose of nationalist priorities. Here I slightly disagree with what you have said about a lot of the 1950s, 60s kind of compact being the unintended consequences of policies that were not actually meant to do so, but maybe I don't know enough about the US case. In any case, so the present moment, I have 23 seconds in the US, and thankfully this is my last slide as well. So, and this is just a bunch of arguments that I am putting forward, maybe more as a citizen than as an researcher. I believe that to combat aggressive anti-immigrant and globally disruptive forms of nationalism, it has to be tamed by bringing it back to the mainstream of politics and policymaking. And so just a bunch of talking points. The relevant benchmark for us to measure the success of an economic policy maybe should be the living standards of the bottom 20 or 50% of the population, rather than fetishize economic growth, as has been the case in the past generations. And in trade and immigration policies, the interests of working and middle-class Americans should be privileged over those of global corporations, foreign workers, and future immigrants, as has been the case, I think, in the past generation or so. And this can be easily be combined with a reaffirmation, so it doesn't have to be an anti-immigrant, xenophobic kind of position. This can be combined with the reaffirmation of narratives here in the US about the United States as a nation of immigrants, that's a source of pride and as something that distinguishes the US from other similar countries, and a commitment to end both undocumented immigration, which is unique to the U.S. At least in the dimensions, on the one hand, and the outcast status of undocumented immigrants that are already in the country, so some kind of path to citizenship. And similarly, the shared interest of a diverse nation should be emphasized, rather than pitting whites and males against all others, as it is currently done, both by right-wing nationalists who defend, the privileged place of whites and males in the moral order of the nation, and liberal progressives who try to overturn this situation but rely on the same basic categories of identity. So a renewed emphasis. Mark Lilla, who's a colleague here in history, has some detailed suggestions of how to do that, and I kind of think that they're pretty reasonable and sound. Okay, maybe I'll just stop here because much of what I am outlining here, which is kind of derived more from an analysis, is actually already happening across the political spectrum. Most of these points that I'm raising are picked up by one or the other political movement. So it looks like nationalism and nationalist concerns, both for self-rule and for privileging the interests of a national majority over elites, has already been seeping into the political platforms of the various parties. And overall, I think this might not be a bad thing at all. Thank you.
Morning, I'm Charles Kolb. I'm officially a recovering lawyer, but for 15 years I played economist as the president of the Committee for Economic Development. So Ned, I thank you again for giving me an opportunity to continue in my economist role. So in preparing for this discussion, I actually did go back and look at some famous economists. And of course, many of you will know the quote by John Maynard Keynes, who said that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economists. So I guess today, Keynes would be regarded as a defunct economist, but he said two things that I think are very important as we focus on the themes of this conference. He said that capitalism is the astounding belief that the most wickedest of men will do the most wickedest of things for the greatest good of everyone. And then he also said, the political problem of mankind is to combine three things: economic efficiency, social justice, and individual liberty. And it seems to me that those 3 points that Keynes made some years ago are really part of what we're talking about today. So I'm actually somewhat encouraged when I look at the resurgence of progressivism, socialism, and nationalism. I think Doug Holtz-Eakin reminded us that some of the enthusiastic thinking behind progressivism and socialism might actually be constrained by the realities of the capital markets or the bond markets, or a national debt that's now at $22.7 trillion. But I think that what we're going through is actually a very healthy discussion, because in one sense, I do agree with the earlier comments that we have probably lost our way in the United States, certainly within probably the last 10 or 15 years. And I wonder if we would be having this conference today if in fact there had not been a Great Recession 11 years ago, or if in fact Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016. So what we're experiencing today, in my view, is not surprising, but there are some differences that I think are worth exploring, which have given rise to nationalism and populism and the resurgence of socialism and progressivism. So if you go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, there's a quote from de Tocqueville on just about everything. I think he said in the 1830s that he recognized that we were fundamentally an egalitarian society back then. And the type of inequality that we are seeing now was just not present. And I think that description that Tocqueville gave in the 1830s lasted for about another century. And I point to something Joe Stiglitz said this morning when he referenced the recent statement of the Business Roundtable, which I thought was very encouraging. And Joe, I think you said they really didn't mean it. Well, they better. And I'll tell you why I say that. I was privileged to be at the Committee for Economic Development, and CED was founded in 1942. It helped create the Marshall Plan, and its original impetus was to promote shared economic growth. And it's the sharing part that I think we've somehow lost track of. And if you then move forward a few decades, you find a really interesting book by two economists. I think they are at Cornell or were at Cornell, Thomas Frank and Philip Cook. They wrote a fascinating book called The Winner-Take-All Society. And I think that's what we have right now. We have young children who, my daughter is 22, just started at Deutsche Bank. She wants to be CEO by next week. I don't think that's going to happen. That's a joke. She'll be here later. But our young people look at the people here who've made it at the top 1% of the 1%, and they all want to be like that. And we've lost track of the shared aspect of our society. And I think that is what has really created these strains, particularly since 2008. I really commend to you, Andreas has a fabulous article in the March-April 2019 issue of Foreign Affairs. It's absolutely fantastic, and all of you should really go out and buy Binya's book, The Economist's Hour, because he hints at the possibility that maybe the elites have failed us. He actually says that the era of the economists ended, I believe, on October 18th, 2008. I don't know if you have that. It was an hour when they met with the Treasury Secretary. So the question is, what are the elites going to do for us going forward? And buried in Binya's book, I think towards the end, is an interesting quote from another defunct economist, Karl Polanyi, who said basically that fairness erodes capitalism and capitalism erodes fairness. And I think what we're seeing now, and what we've been discussing this morning, is the tension between these two strains in American life. And if you go back to 2008 and how we have responded to the Great Recession, it's not encouraging for the future, because we have basically responded, our elites, our financial elites have responded to what my former boss, I worked for David Stockman at the Office of Management and Budget some years ago, and of course Dave writes daily an economics blog, and his critics have said that he has been successful in predicting 9 out of the last 4 recessions. But if you look at his numbers, they're a bit concerning. So we have had basically profligate monetary and fiscal policy for 11 years. What do I mean? Monetary policy, we've had 0 or negative interest rates for almost a decade. A quarter of the world economy is in negative interest rates. Europe, Denmark, Sweden, Japan. That's unreal. We have $22.7 trillion in national debt. We're about to go back to $1 trillion annual national deficits. And these are not sustainable. And so at some point, Herbert Stein, the famous economist, actually also at CED, used to say, if something is unsustainable, it will stop. So this is going to stop. And the strains and the pressures that we're seeing now are probably going to get worse. And at issue is how the elites are going to respond. So Wall Street has become a winner-take-all society. If you're a saver in America, you're probably stupid. The incentives now are to spend, not to save, or at least put the money in your mattress. And so what are we saying to young people? We have an economy, 70% of which GDP is driven by consumer spending. So we're encouraging this kind of winner-take-all spending mentality. We're not saving an investment. Earlier comments about the decline of R&D in this country are very much concerned. And frankly, I don't see much in terms of political leadership either by maybe the progressives, Joe. You highlighted the importance of getting back to really significant national investments in infrastructure and R&D, and I think that's absolutely right on track. Figuring out how to pay for it is another issue. But as Doug pointed out, you can't just add on $33 trillion of health care in the current climate. So it's not clear to me. I'm an optimist, but it's not clear to me how all of this is going to play out. One good thing, I haven't heard any reference this morning to authoritarian capitalism, so it may mean that we've moved past a belief that we're going to be overtaken by a Chinese model. But I do think that what's going on now, driven by this resurgence in nationalism, populism, progressivism, and socialism, is going to be a healthy development for the country. How it plays out politically is really up to all of us. But I do know that the situation that we have now is not going to be with us, I'd say, 5 years from now. So in my role as a moderator or discussant, I actually would like to open up discussion in the remaining 5 minutes here. And I want to really ask Binya a question that comes out of his book, because you're somewhat negative on the where the elites have gotten us today, and we are part of the elites. So where do you see the economics profession in the future? Why should we trust the economists who basically, when you said their time ended 11 years ago? So let me give you the floor back if I could.
Yeah. So I think part of the problem we've encountered is that our elites have let us down, and part of the solution is for them to do a better job. But to be specific, I think that, one of the big areas in which they've let us down is, the idea that inequality wasn't important, that it didn't need to be a priority of policymaking, that we could make policy without particular regard to the distribution. That's a problem, and the solution is to pay more attention to it and to make inequality and the reduction of inequality a focus of public policy, a priority of public policy. And I think we are seeing movement in that direction. I don't think economists disappeared in 2008, obviously, and I'm encouraged by a lot of the new work and directions that I see in economics. My hope is that as they engage the problem, their ideas will begin to filter into the policy context.
Andreas, do you want to comment?
Well, I would like to defend economists, although as a sociologist, what we most of the time do is try to bash our colleagues in economics, but I don't think this is a matter really of power of a profession or something like that. So I think it's what kind of economics have been dominant in the past, and economics is such a heterogeneous field. I mean, it goes from people like Paul Krugman, whose policy prescriptions are radically different from some of the economic advisors of the current president. So I think economics is never has been a monolithic block. Maybe they agree on methods and data and so on, which is good, but not on the actual substantial analysis. So I think we need economics to get out of where we are right now, maybe even more so than before.
I know we stand between you and lunch, so let me conclude, if I could, with another quote from John Maynard Keynes. It's actually the other half of the paragraph on defunct economists. I think it's particularly relevant now, given where we are politically in this country. This is the other sentence that I left out before. Madmen in authority, who hear voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Let's just hope that this White House is listening to some of these defunct economists. Thank you very much.